Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC versus week number 4 overview and analysis video. It's the final week of the regular season here in the LEC. We will know our 8 teams that are officially qualifying for the playoff stage, and of course, inversely, our 4 teams that have officially been eliminated from LEC versus by the end of today's video. Only 2 games per team, so the groundwork has been laid, but with all of these ties, with all of these teams that are kind of congregating towards the middle of the standings, there still is a ton to play for even going in to the final 2 days. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below, what were you expecting from this week? Who did you think was going to get into the playoffs, and who did you think was going to miss out? And did that live up to your expectations? Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the content. If you are new here and you haven't been following my other LEC analysis videos over the course of this year, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. At the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. No power rankings update at the end of week number 4 because the power rankings are irrelevant as we get into the playoffs. I will be showing the playoff bracket, kind of going over the matchups that we got in round number 1 for the 8 teams and talking about who I think will be moving on and who I think will be moving down to the lower bracket and who could be in trouble in terms of the way that the bracket has turned out. Of course, it doesn't really matter if you're the 4th or 5th best team in the league right now if you cannot beat the teams that are in front of you in the bracket itself. So that's what we will be talking about at the end of the video, but most of today will be spent talking about the games in week number 4. So let's get into day number 1, our first day, and it kicked off with a very, very big result here between Team Heretics and Fnatic, where Team Heretics are going to pick up a massive victory for themselves. This team is kind of very quietly on fire right now. I talked about this a bit at the end of week number 3, where they really kind of found their style and the way that they wanted to play the game at the end of the 3rd week, and they started to come around towards this idea of, okay, Ice is going to be our carry down on the bot side. We're going to let him play hyper carries, and we're just going to let everybody else on the team kind of fall into that. Tracing can do well in the 1v1 if left isolated, but Sheo, Saren, Stend, they all need to be pieces that can help Ice be able to carry in the late game. They go away from that at the beginning of week number 4, and honestly, when I watch this draft, I'm decently concerned for Team Heretics. I really don't think this is a draft that sets them up in a really good way. You kind of need multiple players on this team that are not necessarily the stars of the team to take over and carry the game, but that's exactly what ends up happening. They just outplay Fnatic in a lot of key areas. Fnatic ends up really underperforming in this particular matchup. Their mid-jungle duo just, they don't have chemistry right now. Things are not really working out. There is a bigger question to ask here when it comes to the way that things are working out between jungle and mid overall on Fnatic, because I think this is something that's been hyper prevalent for this team for like 3 or 4 years in a row now, and that's certainly a bit concerning. But for Heretics, this is a massive success, and this puts them in a really good spot moving into the final day. Obviously, you can never really confirm yourself here in the LEC, but they are white hot, and their record is getting better and better game over game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Sheo, for me, is going to get player of the game here. Massive jungle gap. I mean, let's just be honest. This Dr. Mundo was significantly more relevant than the Xin Zhao. I've said this for a while, Mundo kind of bullies out every LEC team. It's really funny to watch how this ends up happening because no other region sees Mundo having nearly the level of success that the LEC sees it having. There are a lot of champions in the game that are just generally better in Western League of Legends than they are in Eastern League of Legends, and Mundo to me is like near the top of that list because teams just don't really understand how to play against him in the early game, how to set him behind so he can't get to the point where he can just Omega take over the game. I think tempo is really important, and Mundo doesn't necessarily offer that, but when you have a Xin Zhao on the other side that just isn't playing the game, is playing around Vincere and Corki and Jax and a lot of these scalers, of course Mundo is going to become Omega towards the end of these games. I think that's one of the big reasons why Mundo in particular is good in the LEC and not, you know, the LCK and the LPL, or at least not nearly as good in the LCK and the LPL, is because LEC generally as a region, they draft a lot of scaling. Like, this is a region that is not comfortable picking a lot of early game champions and just trying to snowball games out of control, at least consistently, and I think that really ends up punishing a lot of LEC teams against champions like this. So credit to Sheo for like understanding his role. Going deathless on Mundo was not a particularly easy thing to do in professional play, but he was significantly better than Razork, and the moment he started getting online, when he hit that second item power spike, this game was over. There was no way for you to be able to break through that Dr. Mundo, even with as much damage as Fnatic has at the end of the game. You have an Orianna ball on top of a Mundo. You've got something like a Rel and an Ambessa to be able to create. That means that Mundo doesn't have to dive as deep as maybe you would think he would have to in a lot of these circumstances, and Ice can obviously follow up with a lot of damage on top of the Orianna. it's really difficult to end up fighting front to back, even when you have a lot of damage on the side of Fnatic with this draft. So credit to Heretics. Mundo was huge here, and Sheo, I think, piloted it well. Sheo's been a player that I've needed to see get back into form, and he did so here. I want to give some big credit, though, to the solo laners here for Heretics. Obviously, Imperos was fine, I would say, for Fnatic. Vladi, not so much on the Azir, but Trayson really has not started off all that hot, in my opinion, in the LEC. His laning has looked okay. There have been moments where 1v1, he's looked solid enough, but he has really, really struggled to find major impacts in games as things have gone along. His mechanical talent is very clear, but I think it's definitely been a bit more of an adjustment period than I expected for what I considered the best rookie top laner coming into the LEC, you know, out of the tier 2 scene. It does seem like he's figuring it out here. Again, Imperos is not exactly the most dominant laner in the world, but the Mbessa was finally finding good angles at the end of this game, and Trayson once again did very well for himself in lane. Saren seems to finally be settling in the mid lane. He had a terrible start to the year in terms of the way he was playing laning phases, way too passive, way too scared. That seems to kind of have been turned on its head over the past couple of games. Obviously, I need to see it happen against teams that are a bit more coordinated as opposed to Fnatic, who just isn't right now, but it's still a good thing to see. Ice and Stend have been like the standouts so far for Heretics. Almost every single game that Heretics has won up until this point has been because they have an AD carry on the bot side that's so good on these hyper carries. They are addicted to playing Jhin. I really don't like this as an idea for Heretics. I think this is the kind of draft that they should not really be pulling out. Maybe they're just practicing right now, but they're trying to make playoffs at the current moment in terms of their record. I don't want to see any more Jhin. I don't really understand what their fascination is with it. It's not because I hate Jhin. I really like Jhin as a champion, and I think he can be really strong. This team just doesn't necessarily play around these utility AD carries nearly as well as they play around the hyper carries. That being said, they were still fine this game, just not nearly as relevant as they've been in other series or other games across this year, other weeks. I think Ice is a player that you kind of need to see on Yunara, on, you know, Jinx, on Aphelios, on Corki, you know, these champions that can really have a big team fight impact in the later part of the game. Stend as well, I think, also struggles when he can't just play for the 2v2. He's definitely much more of a roam-oriented player naturally, but this team just isn't really built to do that on the bottom side. Still, even with the bot lane, I think having a couple of problems and Stend being overextended at times, the jungle and really the top side in general was so positive for Heretics that they're able to walk away with a big, big win at the beginning of week 4. Then for Fnatic on the other side, it's really clear. I mean, Razork is dead of the game, and at some point, we have to continue to have this conversation about Razork. I know I've always been a bit lower on him as a player generally on this channel. I don't necessarily think he's ever been truly bad, but there have been very few cases where this guy has actually just been a top 1 or 2 jungler in the league. Like, he is often just inconsistently good for Fnatic, and I think the biggest problem that I have with Razork that has become clear as you watch him now, not only with Vladi, but even last year with Poby and obviously with Humanoid for so many years, is this guy just doesn't play off of his mid laner well. Like, he doesn't really know how to link up with the middle of the map, and that means that his mid laner is almost always going to be more inconsistent than you would normally expect. I do think you can put some of the blame here on Vladi for not playing up to his own standard. He has been underwhelming this year, to say the least, in terms of what the expectations were, but every mid laner that plays with Razork looks worse for playing with Razork. Like, it's just something that has been super consistent throughout his career. The only exception to that rule is maybe Poby last year and maybe VTO, like all the way back on the Misfits days. Like, that, those are really like the only exceptions that I think you could throw out. But especially here on Fnatic, him and Humanoid had terrible chemistry for basically their entire tenure here, and it looks like the same might be happening right now to him and Vladi. It's just really frustrating to see Razork just not really be able to make progress and not be able to play game states that are not perfect for him. He's really good at playing winning spots, and he's really bad at playing anything else. Vladi continues to struggle. I think Lospa finally had a game where he looked like he couldn't really get much done. I'm not really blaming Lospa and Upset, though. They still are the strength of this team, and Pyros, I think, had one of his more interesting games in a while, even if he wasn't perfect on the top side, and Trayson was definitely better than him. But the real concern is that Fnatic just do not look like a complete team right now. Imperos is a player that I don't think is like a good top laner. I think this mid-jungle duo is really struggling in terms of being able to find their connectivity in terms of the way they want to play the game, and Fnatic is not just expecting to be a mid-table team. They want to be top 4, and right now they don't look anywhere close to that. This is a big, big win for Heretics, though. They're going to need to pick up another one on the final day to guarantee themselves a spot in the playoffs, but I thought this team was kind of cooked going into the final couple of weeks, and they've definitely salvaged a lot of great momentum. Then moving on to game 2 of day number 1 here, and we got a predictable result, but in a non-predictable way. It was Shifters taking on Corp Blue, with Shifters being able to pick up the victory as expected in this matchup. They tried their best to lose this, or more specifically, Nuke tried his best to lose this in the mid lane, but at the end of the day, they just had too much gold, and they had too many ways to be able to play their late game team fights with the Skarner and with the Yunara in the back end that they just kind of steamroll their way to victory, despite some massive positioning and teleport mistakes coming in from Nuke. For KCB, I mean, they're just not tier 1 quality. Like, I like this team. I think they're fun, and I'm excited to see what they can do at the tier 2 level. I think a lot of these players should have gotten a lot of progress and experience by playing against these LEC teams regularly, but, you know, they're just not here yet. Like, their macro is not good enough. Their early games are certainly not good enough. Even if that has been the strength of their team, it's just looking a little bit tough to imagine a world where KCB are going to be competitive. They were eliminated already before this week even started, and this really just kind of pushes that even further. But Shifters stay alive, a team that was kind of near the bottom of these standings going into the week. We can go ahead and talk about it, though. Trimby, for me, is going to get player of the game. I think this is kind of up for debate. Trimby was definitely the most active player on the map, in my opinion, for Shifters, and I think that's up to you to determine whether or not that was the biggest influence on the game. I agree with a lot of the people that it was. I thought Trimby was very good here, and generally, I think Trimby has been better this split than people give him credit for. He's had like 2 or 3 very bad games, but almost every other game has been more than solid from him. You know, Paddock, I think, as well, in the AD carry role has generally been, you know, underwhelming, and I think Trimby has been doing a lot more than he gets credit for in terms of how that bot lane 2v2 has been going. When you look on Reddit or on Twitter, a lot of these social medias, people are talking about how Trimby has just been like awful for Shifters this year, and I really don't agree with that. I would actually argue that he's probably been their best player. I don't know. Nuke has also probably been their best player, but he completely ran it down today. So maybe I just have a little bit of like blindness in terms of, you know, where Nuke is at right now. But Trimby, I think, has been fine for this team. I still think that, you know, with a more cohesive roster and potentially a bit more talent around him, he could do a lot. He's just taking a lot of risks, and not all of them are paying off. But in this game, it definitely worked out. He was much better than everybody else on the side of KCB, and certainly ended up pushing the game forward. Paddock as well, like I said, also doing a lot on this Yunara. I want to see him, you know, play more aggressive. One of the things that I've been frustrated with, if you've been watching my videos over the course of this year for Shifters, is that Paddock was the most aggressive LCK AD carry that I've ever seen. He really was the kind of guy that would try and 1v3 and, you know, get a kill and trade his life and just hope his team could win fights. Like, I've never seen a guy who just had more reckless abandon from that AD carry position than Paddock did when he was on DRX and even last year on KT. Really felt like he just had that mentality where he was going to try to 1v9 every game. We've seen none of that so far in the LEC. I have no idea where it's gone. That aggressive mentality has just not followed him over here to Europe, and I kind of hope he gets it back here, because this team really needs an X factor, and they just don't really seem to have it right now. You want that to be Rooster on the top side. He's still a player that I think mechanically has an argument for being top 2 or 3 top laners in all of the LEC right now, just in terms of like raw mechanics, like I said, but he's not really able to actualize it all that regularly. Tao has not really been able to go up against anybody and be able to hold his own, so Rooster was fine in this one. Bukata obviously is not that guy in the jungle. He was much better than Yukino here, but that's because I think the game state was just so unlosable for Shifters. I do think he played well on the Skarner, and maybe this is the adaptation that they need, is just play champions that are a little bit more straightforward in these team fights, like the Skarner, even if they're not particularly meta right now. Just do whatever you need to do in order to make sure he's in a spot where he's not one of the worst junglers in the entire league. But the rare thing is happening in this game, which is that dud of the game is going to stay on the winning team, and it's going to Nuke. As much as I want to give it to Yukino, who I don't think played particularly well, Hazel, who I thought had some really terrible positioning mistakes on the Kai'Sa in this game, I kind of have to give it to Nuke, if only just out of like pure rage, because he tried his best to lose this game on the Azir, and I don't really know what's happening. You know, with Nuke, maybe he's just Omega tilted. I could definitely see that being a bit of a possibility for him, because he has been the only player that has been trying for Shifters at all across this year. Up until this point, there have been so many games where it's like Nuke did well and everybody else on the team was a disaster. His jungler's the worst in the entire league. You know, his top laner is underperforming. His AD carry is playing like he's super scared to even be here in the first place. Like, there have been so many frustrating moments for Shifters where Nuke was not the problem, that for them to pick up a win here against KCB and for Nuke to actually be the problem on the team is really surprising, and not something that I expect to be more consistent for this team. I still really like Nuke. He just was not very good on the day, making a ton of mental errors, obviously, in terms of like what to do with teleport or just how to play the map, generally speaking. And then, of course, obviously wasn't, you know, positioning well in these fights either. Those are minor things, though. I imagine he's going to be back into better form here, and Shifters was able to win anyways. So, you know, hopefully they're going to be able to fix things up, because this team should not be anywhere close to being like bottom 1 or bottom 2 of the LEC teams. And unfortunately for them, they still kind of need a miracle in order to make playoffs, which would be decently frustrating. And then for KCB on the other side, everybody was bad. Like, everybody kind of underperformed here. Like I said, specifically Yukino and Hazel, I think were really not as good as maybe you would want in this particular game. I think both of them have had their moments. Yukino obviously is the best player on this team, and for the most part has been the one that's been carrying them to a lot of their victories, or their only victory across this split up until this point with Los Ratones. But Hazel as well, I think, has had some good moments. I'm definitely a bit lower on his impact so far in tier 1. I think Prime has been doing a lot of the work in the support position, and when Hazel's out of position, he's like really out of position. Same thing for Kamalu, but I think at the very least he was trying to do things. Tao was just not very good in lane. KCB played like KCB in this one, where they just didn't really have the talent to be able to play past the mid game. It's just what they've been all split long. They're the worst team in the LEC, and I don't want to spend too much time criticizing them because they, weren't expected to be good anyways. But Shifters pick up an important win here. They need to get another one on the final day to even give themselves a chance to get into the playoffs because they were games behind everybody else. So we'll see how their split ends up going, but at the very least, they should have the opportunity to be more competitive in the final week here. Then moving on to our third game of day number 1, and it's another big win for a team that needed it. It was SK Gaming taking on Los Ratones, and LR picks up the victory. They are on a ridiculously good streak right now. This team has been fantastic, 5-1 in their last 6 games, which is just ridiculous with the way that they started. They started 0-4, and now they're sitting in a spot where they control their own destiny going into the final day. If they can pick up a win, they have a pretty good shot of being able to make the playoffs as a tier 2 team in the LEC. I did not think this was going to be possible for any of the provisional tier 2 teams going in to the league this year, but Los Ratones has made it possible. They have made it, a reality with the way that their players have played, and you just got to be excited for how this organization has functioned. For SK Gaming, this isn't even an upset, and I think that that is the most depressing thing about where this team and this org is at. There was some hype, I think, going into this year that Mickey X and Wunder and, even Skeens or Yopa to an extent could be like interesting players. Leader was obviously always going to be a bit of a question mark in the mid lane, but everything has gone wrong for SK over the course of this year, and this draft is terrible for them. There are multiple ways that you can point out this draft not really being able to play the game as things continue to go along, and they don't really have a lot of early pressure either. I'm not really sure what is going on with SK right now, but it's all kind of falling apart. So let's go ahead and talk about it in positive conversations for LR at the very least. Player of the game, kind of up to you. I think everybody ended up performing the way that you want them to. They are the exact opposite of what every typical tier 2 team in a tier 1 league will be. We see it with KCB, I think, is like the traditional tier 2 team in the LEC right now, where it's like they have some good early games and they are able to play lane relatively well, but it's the macro that they just don't really have because they don't have a ton of experience playing at this level and playing like professional League of Legends as opposed to solo queue. It's, it's well and good to have the hands to be able to dominate at this level, but for an entire team of young players that don't have a ton of experience in tier 1 to be able to come together and, really be good macro-wise, it's hard. But LR is not a team that is full of players that are not used to playing in the LEC. Nemesis, Crowny, Reckless, all of these players have, obviously decently historic tenures here. Reckless, obviously one of the best players in European history. Even Nemesis and Crowny have had a lot of success, have been to Worlds representing the LEC. This team is not struggling for macro. It's the early game that has been a nightmare for LR, but in this one, they go neutral in the early game, and that's why I'm so frustrated with the draft from SK. First off, you're full AD, which is just not very good, like in most context. I mean, I guess you have Nico as a support that could potentially offer you something, but, Xin Zhao, Yone, Yunara is not a very good jungle mid ADC trio that you want to be building around, especially going into a player like Baus that is going to be building mostly tank in the back end of the game. Ryze was nearly unkillable throughout the back end of this game, which is not something you ever really want to say about the mid laner, but even more so than that, SK was so passive against a team whose #1 weakness is their early game, and they draft Ornn, they draft Yunara Nico onto the bot side. You have no actual, pressure on the map here. How are we doing this? Baus has been a player that's minus 800 gold on average at 15 minutes, and you draft Ornn into him to just let him have a free laning phase. I just don't really understand the idea behind SK. Of course, credit to LR for being able to go neutral in that early game, and then of course just kind of outperforming SK in the late game like we would have expected them to in the right circumstance. But why are we even there in the first place? Baus is player of the game for me because I think he was the most useful at the back end, and quite frankly, this is the only game he's played all year long where he's even been close to neutral at 20 minutes, and, he was neutral. The Gragas looked fine. This is one of his best champions, obviously, that he's known for on stream. Not surprising to see him have a good game on it. I just don't understand why Wunder, the best player on SK Gaming right now, is picking Ornn in a matchup where you're going against the worst laning top laner in the entire league. It just makes absolutely no sense in my mind. It's a complete waste of a draft pick, but again, Baus was excellent. He ends up making a really nice play around that final fight that really ends up kind of shifting the entire game in favor of LR. He's made a lot of these over the course of this split. I'm not going to say he's been great because it's hard to say that someone who loses in lane as much as he does has been, valuable to the team. I think he's overall been more of a net negative than a net positive, but again, his team fighting is excellent, and clearly he is able to excel in that part of the game if you allow him to get there. It's just less up to him. Whether he gets there, it's more up to the enemy team. I do want to give a big shout out to Crowny, who I think has been awesome over the past 4 games or so for Los Ratones. I think this is a player that people were really out on at the beginning of the split. It wasn't very good at the end of 2025 and really did not have a good summer split, and then obviously came into the year, and when this team went 0-4, he was one of the bigger problems on the team. He just was one of the weaker AD carries in the entire league. I think he's gotten a lot more comfortable playing over the past couple of weeks and certainly over the past couple of games, because he's been super aggressive with his position. He's flashing in on Corky, taking over in some of these fights. I really considered him for player of the game, and quite frankly, it probably should go to Crownie, but I ended up settling on Baus because he survived the early game, and that was really positive for LR. Nemesis also continues to be by far the best player on this team. Honestly, I'm kind of at the point where I want to see him in the LEC on a different roster the rest of this year. This SK team could actually really benefit from bringing in a player like Nemesis. I really don't think that that would be a bad addition for SK if Nemesis even wants to join that organization. He's had some choice words for, orgs like SK, so I don't even imagine he might even be looking at that right now, but he would be an upgrade to quite a few LEC teams in the mid lane in terms of the way he's played. I still don't understand why teams are giving him Ryze, best mid laner in the game, and he's been awesome on it. Just a big confusing thing. Velia and Reckless were solid. Reckless was baiting people out with his KDA procs and, forcing people to target the Karmine every single fight, and we'll talk about SK's team fight, execution in this game, but LR just looked great, and they were allowed to look great in this game, and that is still my big concern with LR, is that they don't really create their own advantages. They more so just kind of hope and pray that their advantages are allowed to happen in the later part of the game, which I don't think is nearly as consistent, but at the bare minimum, they're able to capitalize and win games when most teams in this area wouldn't be able to. So credit to them. And then for SK, this team is just so bad. They're so uncoordinated. It's a nightmare, right? Like you're going neutral against the worst early game team in the entire league. And then when you get to the team fight stage, you're watching a team that, engages multiple seconds after each other. You watch a Nico go in with basically no backup, and then Wunderest to try to salvage the play by burning Ornhorn and hitting one person, most likely the Karma in the exchange. Leader is playing super passive and super safe, despite the fact that he has all the gold for SK. He ends up ulting like multiple one-person targets towards the end of fights once you've burned all your other cooldowns, and Yappa has no help from the rest of the team. It's just a complete disaster class in macro from SK Gaming. I really don't even know what to say at this point. Everything is just kind of falling apart. I'm giving dead of the game to Mickey. I can't even count, it's probably just 2, but I can't even really count how many times this game I was just like, hey man, if you just played with the rest of your team, maybe you actually have a chance to be able to win this game. They weren't out of this game by any metric. Again, I talked about this. LR was neutral going into the late game, which is a bad thing for SK, but it still was a neutral game state that SK had plenty of chances to be able to win. They just executed worse in the late game, and I think a lot of that were the pop blossoms from this big engage tool in the Nico that just weren't landing. Mickey has not been good over the course of this split. It's not just this ubiquitous bad because he brought bad players on and has said some questionable things about the teammates that he really wanted to go to bat for on this team. It's not just the team building that I'm criticizing Mickey for. I actually think his gameplay has just been bad over the course of this year, which is really concerning. Again, Yopa wasn't very good in this game, but he has no assistance. I've never seen the AD carry get left out to dry by his team nearly as much as Yopa on this SK team. The only other player I can ever remember like that was Upset when he was on K-Corp. It was really funny. I complained about it a lot during that split where it's like, man, they just do not care about playing around Upset, and I feel like a similar thing right now is happening for Yopa on this team. Leader had all the gold and did absolutely nothing with it. In the late game, he played his best champion and still couldn't carry the game. Not really a good sign there. Skeens continues to be one of the weakest junglers in the league, and Wunder, your only good player, was on a tank on the top side where he wasn't able to punish the weakest laning top laner in the entire league. Again, I'm gonna lose my mind if I talk about SK any further. This was a disastrous loss for them. They do not look like they're gonna be anywhere close to being a playoff team, and they are definitely worse than, at the very least, one of the tier 2 teams in this league, which is a nightmare. LR genuinely look like a top 8 team right now. They might have dug themselves too big of a hole at the start of the split, depending on how things go tomorrow, but still, the fact that they're even in contention to make top 8 and to make the playoffs is already a massive win for an org and a team that really didn't expect themselves to be here in the first place. Then moving on to our 4th game of day number 1, and a very, very fun and big result here as Na'Vi took on G2 Esports, with Na'Vi dominating this game and picking up a very easy victory. It has become clearer and clearer with every game that we have watched from this team, and really every game that we've watched from G2 and Fnatic and these teams that are listed above them that theoretically should be good, but just kind of aren't right now, that Na'Vi is a top 3 team in the LEC, bare minimum. I mean, this team has placed their stock as high as it could possibly go at the current moment. You you have teams, like I said, like G2 and Fnatic that are really struggling. I do not think those teams are better than what Navi is right now. I think they are winning everywhere across the map. I think they have a great understanding of where the meta is at. I've said this before, but I think they have the best meta read at the beginning of the year in Europe. Really the only good meta read, I would say, of any like true team in Europe. I think Corp has a good understanding of what they do well, but Navi just gets what is supposed to be played in this meta, and no other team is really able to deal with them because they have such good hands in a lot of key areas, and that means that they can allow the players that, or really the one player that needs time to ramp up in SamD to get to the spot where he can start taking over. And G2, I'm gonna say it, man, I'm so tired of taking victory laps on this team. I feel like every single time we talk about a G2 game, I'm always like, y'all should have listened to me about Hansama and Labrav. Y'all should have listened to me about Broken Blade last year. Like, I know that I've been really insistent on this, and I know that it can get kind of annoying, but like at some point, we just have to accept that like, these guys aren't good. Like, they're just not good. They are propped up by the fact that the rest of this team worked well as a unit last year, that the rest of the LEC was super far behind in terms of their meta read last year and underwhelmed in the summer split, and that they kind of got fortunate in the Worlds run. Like, Hans and Labrav just are not a Worlds caliber bot lane. Broken Blade is just on a different planet right now. I have no clue what that guy is doing. Skewmond was carrying at the beginning of the split. He started to fall off. Caps is the only player who's in good form right now, and it just doesn't matter. You can't win with one player, not against a team like Navi. So let's go ahead and talk about it. SamD for me is going to get player of the game. Again, I know I was a lot lower on SamD, and one of the big reasons why I wasn't really in on this team as like a day one success kind of team at the beginning of the split was because I didn't really trust this bot lane at all. I thought SamD and Paris were going to struggle out of the gate to be able to create. Paris was not very good last year in terms of being able to create, and obviously was very good at the tier 2 level, but SamD's never been a player that I've been all in on this channel. I've been pretty negative about him, but you get the right circumstance around him. You get a player like Relich in the jungle that's really aggressive, Poby who's constantly winning and pushing forward in the 1v1, and Paris really stepping back up. Now all of a sudden SamD's biggest weakness, which is his mechanics, like his ability to actually generate his own lead, he's just not a particularly mechanically dominant player. It's kind of hidden because he gets to play Aphelios and he gets to scale into the late game where he can just kind of take over in these 5v5s. It's the perfect combination for Navi. They found the exact way that they need to play in order to make sure everybody on the Rift for them is in the most comfortable position possible, and it's really benefiting everybody. Again, SamD, easy choice for me for player of the game. I considered Relich as well, and we'll talk about that, but SamD was excellent. Paris was excellent in this game. They just both omega gapped their opposition. People were really looking forward to SamD versus Hansama because SamD, Hansama, this was not close. One of these AD carries is clearly better than the other right now, and it definitely is not Hansama. D is definitely better than A in terms of how this matchup is going. Again, Paris completely outclassed Labrav. These two players to me are always going to be at least semi-linked because of last year. BDS had the opportunity to either keep Labrav or promote Paris internally. They chose to promote Paris. That's why Labrav went to G2. Both of those orgs wanted Paris over Labrav, and I think we're seeing why now that he actually has the right system and the right structure around him. You know, this is a team that I think has generally been able to elevate everybody, but Paris just needed to get back into form, right? This was the best support prospect I ever evaluated coming out of tier 2, at least in the ERLs, right? Like, obviously in other regions, it's not Paris, but like in Europe, it's Paris, right? He is the best tier 2 support player in my time covering the ERLs and EMEA Masters and all of that stuff on BDS Academy, and to finally see that coming to fruition on the LEC stage is really exciting. Relich is a monster. This guy's kind of on pace to win MVP right now of the Winter Split, if you want to consider MVP like even a title that somebody can earn in LEC versus. Like, it's all up to you whether or not you want to give that out, but he is bare minimum top 3 in terms of the voting for that. I don't really think a lot of people are going to argue in that direction. Poby has been great in the mid lane. Can't believe Fnatic got rid of him. Mainter has been better day number 1 than I ever anticipated. Now he's just winning everywhere across the map. This is genuinely a scary team that a lot of teams are going to have to deal with in the playoffs, and they're not going to go down easy. I can promise you that. For G2, I mean, they're just completely falling flat right now. You have 2 good players on this roster, and one of them didn't even play well in this game in Skewmond in the jungle. First off, I want to repeat this. Like, I know I've said this a couple of times about G2. Their meta read just continues to be horrendous. Pantheon must have like a sub 25% win rate when he is not with either Ryze or Taliyah. Like, Pantheon is a very good champion when he gets to play with Ryze, Taliyah, even Galio. I think you have to really supplement other parts of your draft if you pick Galio, but Pantheon is built built to play with mid laners that can shove and roam, that can move around the map. Azir might be the single worst mid laner in the meta that you can pick with Pantheon. Aurelion Sol is actually pretty darn close, but at the very least, ASol can roam a lot more efficiently. I just don't understand why LEC teams are so enamored with this idea of, okay, we're going to pick Pantheon, and then we're going to pick a scaling mid laner. What is Pantheon supposed to do in this game? Stand there and hope that his Azir accidentally wins lane so that he can gank him? You know, gank bot lane with Leona going into Aphelios Nautilus? Like, what are we supposed to be doing here? As the Pantheon, it's just kind of making me lose my mind that teams do not seem to be realizing that this is a massive problem and that this is working in no regions across the world. No one is winning games when they draft like this. It's not just that, though, because you take your Pantheon and Azir and you put them on your two best players, and now they're at a disadvantage because of draft, and the players that should be doing well in the early game, the Ezreal and the Renekton, are two of the weakest players on your roster. Broken Blade has been a nightmare across this year. This guy doesn't even look like a top half LEC top laner in terms of the way he's played in these best of one so far. Hansama and Labrav are, again, a bottom half bot lane duo. Kind of predicted this going into the year. Maybe I wasn't even harsh enough on the way that they were going to perform this year, because it's not just the fact that they're losing in the 2v2. They're so anti-synergistic that they're not even playing together in the mid game. Hans is left alone, so he can't really do any damage on this Ezreal, and Labrav is off in Narnia trying to make plays with his jungler who can't follow up. Like, it feels like everything is wrong for G2 right now. Labrav, for me, is dud of the game, but if you wanted to give it to Broken Blade, if you wanted to give it to Hansama, like, all three of them were so thoroughly outclassed in this game that it's just kind of ridiculous. This is a bad G2 team. This isn't even a team that right now is close to being top 3. Like, you want to project them as being top 4 because they're G2 and you think they'll be able to get it together. Caps is in good form. You know, I think Skumon can figure things out, but like, really, if you're just going off of the best of one tapes that we had, this is not a top 4 team. This is nowhere near a top 4 team in terms of the way they're executing. I think they have a ton to prove going into the end of this year, and there's still really not a lot of confidence from me that they're going to be anywhere close to qualifying for first stand or near the top of the standings by the end of these playoffs. Na'Vi right now looks like a better team, and I would rank them higher in the power rankings. I didn't have the balls to pull the trigger on them earlier on in the year, but this really solidifies it for me. This was not just a win. This was a decimation from a playstyle and just overall macro and mechanics perspective. They were better in every aspect. They destroyed G2, and that convinces me that this is genuinely one of the best teams in the entire league. Then moving on to game number 5 of day number 1, and another big upset happens here. We've gotten very used to these in the LEC. It was Team Vitality taking on Movistar Koi, and Team Vitality pick up yet another victory. This team is on fire right now in terms of the way that they are playing in the LEC. They've been able to take down some really big names over the past couple of games, and if they can just get out of their own way in terms of a lot of the mistakes that they make in the mid game, they could be one of the better teams in the entire league. I've kept them at number 7 because it's just so hard to actually believe in a team with Humanoid and Karzi and, you know, even Linsauce to like a lesser extent, although I like him and I like the way he's been playing recently. But at some point, I just have to start believing. I have to start going, yeah, they keep winning, and these wins are real, and what they're doing is super repeatable and consistent, and they're not making those mistakes anymore. I have to hope that that's going to be consistent for Vitality, but that's really all it is right now, is hope. For Movistar Koi, I don't know what to make of this team, man. In their wins, they look like the best team in the entire league, and it doesn't look particularly close, and they do so against some really good competition. They were able to take down Corp earlier on in the split, and that's really the game that I'm holding on to, where I'm like, yeah, they looked like clearly the best team in the LEC in that game, but then you watch this and you're like, man, do they just know what they're doing on the map or not? Like, it feels like they're so close to being incredible, and yet they're just not grasping the things that they actually need to grasp in order to actually get wins or even to be competitive in some of these games. Feels like they're like 1 or 2 pieces away, but those pieces are just massive pieces that are really stopping them from being, you know, super consistent. So it's frustrating because the talent is clearly still there. I don't really know what they need to fix in order to get better, and I'll kind of talk about that as we get into them. But for Vitality, player of the game is going to go to Fleshy once again. This guy's been phenomenal across this split. I'm not going to sit here and say he's been the best support in the league, but he's been pretty darn close. Like, Busio to me has been the best support in the LEC in terms of the way that he has been playing, as we kind of expected, but Fleshy is really breaking out for me. You know, Karzi's taken a big back seat on this team, which I love. I want to be very clear about that. I think that that is a fantastic role for Karzi to play. That's not to be a negative towards Karzi, just more so like one of the big problems I've had with Karzi over the past couple of years is that every team that he is on has to either play around him or he is going to run down at the very least some of the games that they are playing, and you can't ever really rely on him being a consistent piece. You can't even really ever rely on that team being winnable because Karzi was always going to just naturally lose some games. That was especially prevalent when he was playing with Hylissang, who would also be in a similar boat, but for Carzzy to pair up with Humanoid and, bring on, not bring on, but keep someone like Nako on the top side, I'm like, oh boy, the variance of this team could be out of this world. Now for Carzzy to take a backseat, for Humanoid to be getting more resources, and for Fleshy to kind of be this big playmaker, this is the perfect spot, I think, for Vitality to sit in if they want to try and minimize the variance that they have. And Carzzy, I think, has done a great job of taking that backseat, not really being a main character, really being the one player on Vitality that I've kind of forgotten about across this split. It's a really good thing to say because Carzzy is not really the kind of player you want to build your entire game plan around. If he can just be a solid enough AD carry that has good mechanics, that's like best case scenario for Carzzy in my opinion. And Fleshy being unlocked and being a big playmaker that can roam around on things like Nico, that's also massive. This is one of those games where, yes, I am a little scared of the Pantheon, but Zoe is so much more valuable than something like Azir in this spot because you can open up the map a lot more. You can shove it around even into something like the Rise, who obviously can match with the Realm Warp. And we'll talk about Koi. I don't dislike their draft at all. I think they have plenty of tools and they probably should have won this game, but I think the Zoe really is an underutilized pick, and we've seen it really work out when you have a lot of these other tools that can pop off in late game teamfights like the Yunara. And obviously with the engage coming from Nico, Zoe-Nico has got to be one of the hardest duos to walk into in the entire league, or in the entire game, if you're trying to, come back from behind. Like, if you don't have vision in this game, it's cooked. Like, there's no way for you to ever be able to play, and Fleshy took full advantage of that. Obviously, people are going to point out that final ultimate where he, catches everybody out, and it looks fantastic. JoJo in particular getting caught out. Elyoya just having a bad game, getting hit by multiple Pop Blossoms. Vitality was, really fantastic at following through on that, but Fleshy was the one creating, and again, he's been one of the best supports in the entire league. Credit to him. Humanoid continues to look very good in the mid lane. He's had a couple of really bad games across this split, but most of the games have looked really good, which I think is an encouraging sign. Hopefully the good outweighs the bad as we get to these more important games and these best of threes rather than these best of ones. Linsauce, I think, has started to get back on board again. I've always kind of been a believer in Linsauce. I shouldn't say always, because there was a period of time, about 6 months into his LEC tenure where I was like, oh, I'm out on Linsauce. This guy doesn't have it. He's played really bad at the tier 1 level. But last year, something really clicked for me in the summer split, and I started to believe in him again going back to 2026, and he's kind of paid that out. He's been pretty good this year. He definitely gapped Elyoya on the strongest jungler in the meta. And Nako's the best player on this team. I mean, Fleshy might be the best player on this team, but Nako and Fleshy are really the two players they're building around right now, which is awesome to see for Vitality. I think they're playing exactly how they should to maximize their chances of winning, and it's exciting to see this team really start to get a little bit more consistent and really be good at the end of the regular season. For Movistar Koi, again, I just don't really know what to point to and be like, this is where you're screwing up. I think their drafts are good. I generally think their players are playing fine individually. They're just losing in a lot of these skirmishes and fights. They need to get better in that phase. You imagine that they will, because that was something they were very good at last year, and it doesn't really feel like they're approaching a lot of these fights differently or worse. It just feels like they're not going their way right now, which has got to be even more frustrating for Koi, who are probably sitting there going like, we might miss playoffs, and like what do we even need to fix? Alvaro for me is dud of the game, easily his worst game of the split here on the Bard. I want to say something a little bit aggressive. It's not even passive aggressive. It's really just kind of generally aggressive towards the LEC fan base. Most of that's not going to apply to the people who watch these kinds of videos, but I do want to say this. One of the reasons why I think generally LEC fans are not taken as seriously, like in major international discussions when talking about like their region and everything like that, is because I look on Twitter and I look on, Reddit, and I see like, oh, Alvaro hasn't been good in like a year and a half. Like, this guy's just inting. There's no way Koi can keep him around. Like, this is why nobody takes the fans of this region seriously, is because things like that get perpetrated on a lot of social medias. Again, I want to make it clear, a lot of smart LEC fans, they're probably just not as vocal as a lot of the dumb LEC fans, but like, come on, man. I'm not going to sit here and watch one Bard game and say that this guy can't play the champion. He was excellent at the start of this split. He was super important towards Koi's success last year when they won the league in the spring split. Let's not try and rewrite history. Is he better on these engaged champions? Absolutely. I don't think he fits as well in a meta where enchanters are as valuable. That has more to do with Koi kind of forcing this style more than anything else, because the engagers are definitely still valuable. You can still play them. You don't have to play things like Bard and be this big playmaker around the map, but they clearly feel comfortable in trying to give him a shot at it, and he's had some really good games on things like Karma throughout this split as well. It's just a bad game, and again, it's just an overreaction. I think that that's really what it comes down to for LEC fans. I'm not going to try and overreact. Do I think Koi is definitely a top 2 team? No, I certainly don't think that they are definitely in that conversation, especially with Elyoya having such a bad game on a Jace that he needs to be good on. Mirwin, I think, is still just not a top-tier top laner. He's never going to be a top-tier top laner at this level. JoJo and Supo are making some positioning mistakes. Like, they're not winning skirmishes. There are real issues with Movistar Koi, but overreacting and panicking and saying this team is actually bad bad and they need to replace people, like that is the kind of mentality that I think will keep the LEC as one of the weaker major regions in the world, like for a long time. It's completely helpless, like in terms of how it's going to improve the region. I disagree with it on a fundamental level. But for Vitality, obviously great win. They don't need to get wrapped up in this conversation. They're playing great. Fleshy and Knock in particular are really the stars of this team. Humanoid and Linsas also have great chemistry. And again, Carzzy kind of being the fifth man on a good Vitality team is best case scenario. They are genuinely looking scary. If they can keep playing like this, they're going to be a team to watch going into the playoffs. But that's going to bring us to our final game of day number 1 and the end of the first half of the final week here. And we closed out day 1 with a matchup between Corp and GIANTX, where Corp is going to pick up a dominant victory. And I know we had a lot of kind of blowouts over the course of day number 1, but I think that they were entertaining and informative in a way where it really kind of showcases where a lot of these teams are in terms of the standings. Corp is just so clearly the best team right now in the LEC. In terms of the way that they are functioning, they're the only team with the talent that I think, is actually performing up to that number 1 standard. If that makes any sense, like there are multiple teams that I think have enough roster talent to be at that number 1 spot, but only Corp I think has been consistently performing like they actually deserve to be there. So credit to them. GIANTX has been a good team across this split. They've been one of the better middle table teams, but they are not on Corp's level. They should not be a team that is competing with Corp. This is honestly the expected result. You would have hoped that maybe the bot lane would have done better because they've been so good over the course of this split, but if the bot lane is not winning, this team is not winning. That I can be very, very sure of. Starting with Corp, player of the game for me is going to Bucio once again on this Bard. He must have gotten every single player of the game that he's gotten this split on Bard. I think he got one on Alistair from me, but player of the game, Bard, Bucio, it just feels like it goes together. This was happening all the time in North America last year. Of course, it's been happening throughout his entire career because he's been so good at this champion, but for some reason, teams just keep going, yeah, we'll trade you Bard for Rakan Corki. Like, that's a trade that we're comfortable taking. It's just kind of ridiculous that the best support in the entire region keeps getting the one pick that he is by far the best at over and over again. I get that it maybe doesn't feel worthwhile to spend a bunch of bans on Bucio because his champion pool is relatively deep at this point, but like, it's got to be anything other than Bard. Like, beat me on anything else. That's definitely got to be a conversation that I think these teams have to go through at some point. But Bucio just continues to be fantastic. Best support in the entire region. Fantastic pickup. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk this offseason that G2 kind of rejected bringing over Inspired and Bucio as a combo because they wanted to keep their roster from last year once they made the quarterfinals. Obviously, I had thoughts about that in the offseason that I already went over, where it's like G2 just has a horrible understanding of what their roster talent is right now, and they don't really get what position they were in going into the offseason because they made quarterfinals. I think that might actually turn out to be a bad thing for that organization in the long run because it convinced them that they were actually a really good team, which they were not. But on the flip side, Bucio is still very good. Like, that is where I'm trying to get at with this, is like any team would be lucky to have this guy as a support right now. Basically any team in the world. I think there is a strong case to be made that he is a top 5 support in the world. And he continues to really prove it. Again, Jun is a really good player. Noah is a really good player, and he completely outclassed both of them. Kaliste was a part of that as well on the Jhin, but mostly the Jhin was there so that the Bard could move around with the Jarvan and create a lot of plays elsewhere on the map. Now, Noah was often the target of a lot of those plays, and Kaliste got to benefit in terms of the gold, but at the end of the day, the Jhin was more superfluous than anything else. Kaliste just kind of overplayed what the draft was intended for his champion. Yike continues to look phenomenal in the back end of this split. He was super questionable in week number 1, which I think a ton of people forget about. This team was winning games. I believe they went 2-1 in that first week, only losing to Koi, but Yike was really not good in that Koi game, and he also was kind of bad in some of their other matchups as well, and you really just wanted to see better out of him. And then week 2, week 3, week 4, it's gotten back on track for Yike. I had a lot of people last week, by the way, and this is a bit of an aside if you're one of these people in the comments, I had a lot of people like, how could you put Caps as player of the week? How is it not Bucio or Yike? I totally understand that if you only want to look at their wins, then yeah, it probably should have been Bucio or Yike. I think a lot of people forgot that they got absolutely destroyed in one of their games last week, and that probably was something they just kind of scraped from their memory. But yes, they've been very good in their wins, and they continue to stay consistent when they get these, when they generate their advantages in the early game. That is the way I'll put it. Yehu's been great, much better than I anticipated from day number 1 from a mechanics perspective. Kana has been solid on the top side, maybe not the MVP form that he was in last year, but still very, very good. Corp looked like the best team in the league, and we wanted to see that out of them. And then for GX on the other side, if their bot lane's not dominating, they're not winning games. Like, this top side's fine, but they're not great. Isma and Lot are playable. I think both of them are like mid-table players in their position. Maybe a little bit lower than that for Isma, just because he can be a bit inconsistent. Jackie's has not been very good across this year. Ironically enough, he was definitely not the problem in this game, but if Noah and Jun aren't carrying this team, like, that is why they've been in contention for top 4 and top 5 in terms of the standings throughout a lot of this split, is because this bot lane is one of the best in the LEC, and one of the bot lanes that they are not better than is Kaliste and Bucio. That is very, very clear. Noah, for me, is dud of the game, was constantly getting caught by the Bard, was getting caught by the Jarvan. Like, I get that the Corki can sometimes be hard to play in this particular matchup, but you have that mobility tool for a reason. If you're Valking in, all of a sudden things can get really bad for this team. And obviously, if you blow that cooldown early, you're very susceptible to a lot of the CC coming out from K-Corp throughout the rest of these fights. So Noah having basically an impossible game. Jun also got basically completely outplayed by Busio. Massive support gap in this one. I still really like Noah and Jun, but it's just not going to happen against this KC bot lane in particular. And again, topside was also not very good. Ismo was completely out-jungled by Yike, who's once again looking like one of the best junglers in the region. You know, Jackie's was the only player with any sort of pressure, and Jackie's is not going to be winning you games in the big old 26. So GIANTX, an unfortunate loss, but one that was kind of expected in terms of their, schedule. You can plan out a loss to K-Corp typically, and K-Corp still looking like the best team in the league. Really, the only question is, can they hold on to that success? There were times where they looked like this in summer of last year, and yet they still managed to go and miss Worlds. The big question now is, are they going to have that playoff success that the regular season would clearly kind of lead you to believe they would have? But then moving on now to day number 2 and our final day of regular season action. Remember, it is a shortened week, only 2 days instead of 3, unlike the rest of the split. But starting off day number 2 was a matchup between Team Vitality and Los Ratones. And Team Vitality is going to pick up the victory here to secure their spot, not only in the playoffs, but with a pretty nice record heading into the playoffs. They are going to be a top-tier seed. Remember, top 4 ends up being the, upper part of the bracket. They get side select in round number 1. 1 and 2 will get to choose their opponents on opposite sides of the bracket, but generally, if you can't get top 2, you want to get top 4, and I think Vitality has done a really good job of securing that for themselves with this victory. Unfortunately for LR, with this loss, they are not going to be in the playoffs, and they put up such a good fight, not only in this game, but throughout this entire split, of really kind of shattering the chains and kind of overcoming their own natural disadvantage that they have going into this, being a tier 2 team, having to play a bunch of tier 1 rosters. The fact that any tier 2 team was 1 game away from potentially making the playoffs is insane, but unfortunately for LR, the fairy tale ends here, and Vitality is the one to shut the door on them. In what is a really close game. LR actually is fantastic throughout a majority of the early game, and that's the irony, I think, of all of this, is that they finally have their first good early game of the entire split, and that's the game that they end up losing. Definitely got to be frustrating, but a lot of credit over to Vitality, and for me especially, a lot of credit to Linsauce in the jungle, who is my player of the game in this particular performance. Velia was phenomenal. This is the best game that Velia has ever played. I will say that with my full chest. Like, he has never played this well in tier 2. He certainly has not played this well in tier 1 throughout this split up until this point. This Sylas game was unbelievably good from Velia. He tried his best to absolutely carry, but Linsauce was trying his best to push back on this. You know how much I hate this draft. If you know me, Pantheon paired with Dr. Mundo and Azir as your 2 solo laners just feels like trying to make the Pantheon's life as impossible as you can make it, because there's no plays to be made anywhere on the map. You don't have a single winning lane in this game, which is obviously going to be at least frustrating. Maybe Mundo into Sion, like, if you really want to point it out like that, because it's Baus on the Sion, but overall, you're not looking at this as a winning matchup for the Pantheon, and yet somehow, some way, Linsauce not only is able to generate some gold in the early game, but does a good job of being able to be the one pushing the game forward later on as well. Really phenomenal stuff. He ends up securing a major objective even without Smite, because Velia ends up smiting early. Obviously, not entirely on him, and you can criticize him for not having Smite for that fight, but at the end of the day, Linsauce did what he needed to do to win this game, and I think his Pantheon in the late game teamfights was essential towards this team winning the game, which is almost something you never hear about that champion. He had a great week. He's having a pretty good split, all things considered. There are obviously some bad games in there, and I think, I'm not going to sit here and say he's a top-tier jungler, but this guy has proven himself to be an LEC caliber jungler at this point, and I think Vitality are pretty happy with the development they're getting out of him. Knock continues to look great. This time on the Dr. Mundo that gets flexed up into the top lane. A lot of people just kind of assumed that this was going in the jungle, but the flex ends up working out. Knock makes the proclamation before this game even starts that they are going to give Sion over to Baus, his signature champion, and they become the first team to beat Baus on Sion in comp, which is really obviously impressive, and Knock is just really good. This guy has proven himself to be one of the better top laners in the entire league. I think that there were some moments where the Mundo may have over-aggressed, but that is really nitpicking. This champion was absolutely massive in terms of absorbing a lot of the Yone and Sylas damage at the end of the game. Carzzy continues to look really good. He's yet to really have like a bad game this split, which is certainly not something you say a lot about Carzzy. Again, I went into it earlier on in the video already, but the consistency out of him has actually been genuinely shocking in like a very positive way. Very excited with how he's played so far. Humanoid was okay, not always great in this game. Fleshy, I think, had some engages, especially early on, that he maybe wants to take back, but overall, Vitality end up producing what it matters the most at the end of the game and getting themselves to a point where they are one of the scariest teams in the LEC heading into the playoffs, something I did not expect to say. Then unfortunately for LR, this is the last time that we are going to see them. This will be the last game that they play in Tier 1 and potentially the last game that they play. I don't really know what the future of this organization looks like. They're obviously not going to be in the NLC this upcoming year. They've already announced that. They've announced that they're not going to be in like the LFL or any of the other Tier 2 leagues either. So I don't really know what the goal or the plan is. Maybe this org is just kind of done. Maybe they're going to be looking to try and get into the LEC. I don't know if any of the other orgs are trying to sell their spot, but I'm sure, you know, the league would love to welcome them in if they have the opportunity. But this might be the last time we ever see this group of 5 players play together again. Baus for me is dead of the game. I mean, 3-12 on Scion's obviously not ideal, and this was one of the few games where it just it didn't feel like he had this gigantic impact in the back end. He was still relevant, but he wasn't, you know, dominating in the same kind of way. I don't want to put it all on Baus. I know the KDA ends up looking a little bit worse than maybe you would want, but this is his signature champion, and he's finally getting it in the LEC, and it just is not the game that he ends up performing on. I think you could realistically give dead of the game to Nemesis as well, who makes a game-losing play at the end here on the Yone. But honestly, he was so good for the team throughout the split that it feels disingenuous to take their last game and blame it on him, even if he did kind of make the game-losing play at the end here on the Yone, which was in particular the good. Crowny, I think, did not have a great game. Reckless is deathless, ironically enough, on the Bard, even in their loss. This is a classic Reckless game where he doesn't really have a big impact on the map and generally just tries to play for KDA. Velia 1v9 for a lot of this. This Sylas was absolutely massive for a majority of this game, and if this was Dr. Mundo jungle, I think Vitality probably lose this game with a standard top laner, but the fact that they could flex that Mundo up top and have a Pantheon in the jungle to even really fight a little bit more in the later half of this game ended up really being kind of the critical thing for Vitality. So credit to Velia for having his best competitive game ever, but it's just not enough to push LR across the finish line. And again, I hope this org does something. They obviously have a huge fan base, deserved, because Kadril has done a fantastic job of, you know, being such a pillar of the league community. I don't really know what the future holds for them, but they put up such a great fight in the LEC, better than anybody could have ever anticipated. And for Vitality, they're just one of the best teams in the league. Like, if LR had to run into anybody else at the end of the split, and if they didn't start 0-4, they'd be a playoff team, but Vitality is just not beatable right now. This team is on fire, the hottest team by far in the LEC, and I'm really interested in what they're going to do in the playoffs. Then moving on to our second game of day number 2, and this is a bad one for one of the teams involved, but a very good one for the team that won. It was Corp Blue taking on GIANTX, and KC Blue end off their tenure in the LEC with only their second victory, this time over a GIANTX team that really needed to pick up a win here in order to keep themselves in that top 4, or at the very least keep themselves from not being in this big cluster with teams around like the 4th or 5th spot in the LEC. This is a pretty bad loss. It doesn't really matter all that much for GX as long as they don't get a disastrous, you know, first round matchup, but there are some teams that are around that, you know, 500 mark right now that you don't want to be paired up with because, oh, let's say you get on the same side of the bracket as a Fnatic or a G2. Now all of a sudden the team that is the number 1 team in that group is, or on that side of the bracket, they're not choosing, you know, Fnatic or G2, they're choosing GIANTX to go and face, and now you have to face a Corp or whatever in round number 1. That is worst case scenario for GX, and they've just invited that entire scenario by losing this game for basically no reason. But credit to KCB. Let's give them the praise that they deserve. They have had multiple games where they've been competitive and close throughout this split, but they've just not really been able to close things out. They've not had the discipline or the macro to be able to really take their good game states and turn them into things that, you know, could really expand. It's why I don't think this team has been good at drafting a lot of these scaling comps, but they finally found a win condition in this one with the Aatrox jungle that's been really successful for the teams that have picked it up throughout this split. And you know what? It's clear who the star is on this team. It's Yukino in the jungle. You know, American talent coming over and continuing to make the most of it in the ERLs. It's really, really cool to see that Yukino is kind of, you know, showing everyone why he got a ton of tier 1 offers this offseason, or at the very least got one tier 1 offer over in North America. Him choosing to stay in Europe is massive for Corp and for this region in general, and all he's done is prove that he deserves to be in the LEC. I'm not going to say he would be like one of the best junglers or anything like that, but there are multiple junglers in the league that are definitely worse than Yukino. Again, we've talked about multiple of them near the bottom of the standings, players like Bukata and Skeens. I think Yukino would immediately be an upgrade to both of those players on both of those teams in terms of the way that they are structured. And he can carry, he can facilitate, he can do a little bit of everything. He's just a really fun player. Is he consistent? No, but he got to play with some really bad laners, at least in comparison to tier 1 over the course of this split, and still make a pretty big impact on games as a whole. He finally gets to carry on the Aatrox against this GIANTX team that clearly was not locked in at all this week, really, in any facet, and he absolutely dominated. This pick went nuclear, I think is the fair way to say it, at the end of this game, where he just was unkillable on the Aatrox. So credit to him. This draft is massive, and it's a very good one for KCB, but I have to give a big shout out to Prime as well. I know that I've really hyped this guy up over the course of this split, but there are so many moments where you watch him and you watch the rest of the team and you go, okay, if he had like talent around him, if Hazel was a little bit better as an AD carry, if Kamalu was a little bit better as a mid laner, Prime, I think, could be doing a lot right now for a tier 1 team. I actually see him relatively comparable to Yukino in terms of being ready for tier 1. I think both of those players came out on a team that was not very talented and kind of proved that they individually could really elevate players that, you know, maybe aren't quite at that level yet. Really cool to see out of a player in Prime that, you know, I think had a good floor, but I needed to see more development before I really believed in him as a tier 1 prospect. He is a tier 1 prospect now. Like, he is very firmly on the menu. So Yukino, Prime, definitely the stars of KCB, and I'm excited to see what happens to them through the rest of the year, whether they continue to play for KCB or perhaps some LEC teams come calling, because again, I think both of them would be upgrades to multiple different LEC teams right now if they wanted to go in that direction. Credit to Hazel. I thought he was fine in this game. Obviously, it can be tough going into Noah and Jun, but they were bad across this entire week, and Hazel kind of took advantage of that. Really nice performance from him. Tao was really good on the top side of the map going into Lot. He took a matchup that's very positive with the Rumble and ended up really capitalizing on it. You know, Kamalu's the only kind of holdover. He was fine in this game, but I don't think he was like a superstar. Ironically enough, he might be like the actual worst player on this team, despite being the only player with real tier 1 experience before this year. You know, Kamalu has just never been particularly good, but KCB kind of getting their consolation prize victory here at the end of the split is a really nice feeling, and I'm sure the org is pretty happy about that. And then for GIANTX, like I said, it's not going to be a disaster that they lost this. They'd have already locked playoffs going into this week. It doesn't really matter that they go 0-2, but not only do you lose a lot of momentum by losing to the worst team in the entire league that has only been able to beat the other tier 2 team at any point, you're the only tier 1 team that ended up losing to KCB at any point in the LEC this split. But on top of that, these 2 losses kind of put you back into the middle of the pack in terms of your actual record, which means you might have a pretty tough first round matchup, and you don't want to lose that extra life early. You want to try and keep that for as long as possible if you're a team like GIANTX, and I really think they let themselves down this week. Jun is going to get my dud of the game. Really just not a good performance from this bot lane at all, especially in this game, but like really throughout this week. They were obviously terrible earlier on in the week against actual K-Corp, but we expected that. K-Corp's one of the few bot lanes that is just better and more mechanically talented than GX is. This is not a game where they should be struggling, where Jun should have such a bad performance on Nautilus of all champions. Like, he should be finding engage angles and actually making it work, and it wasn't happening in this one. It was weirdly out of character for a player that I consider to be really consistent for GX. He's got to figure that out. I think Lot also was really terrible on the top side of the map here with the Scion. Absolutely needed to be better in this particular game. You know, Isma, Jackie's, Noah not so much, but Isma and Jackie's, I think, had their moments. Isma was not nearly as good as Yukino, but Yukino had a better champion and a better game state to be able to pilot it from. Jackie's was, ironically enough, probably the best player on GX this week, but that's not really a good thing. He's not a carry. He's not somebody that's going to elevate the rest of this team. I'm not panicking about GIANTX. It was 2 games, and one of them is against the best team in the league. This was a bad loss, and you definitely don't want to see this. It's not really acceptable by this team and by this org, but best of ones happen, and, you know, we'll have to see how they end up, you know, being able to right the ship and make their way into playoffs. But for KCB, again, just going out on a high note has to be the biggest exciting factor. The Tier 2 teams absolutely showed up. I had major question marks about whether or not these Tier 2 teams and these Tier 2 rosters were going to be able to even survive at the LEC level. They did more than that. Both of these teams were really fun to watch across the LEC versus, and I hope they do well throughout the rest of the year. Then moving on to the third game of day number 2, and this is really where I think the day 2 hype ends up beginning, because there are a lot of dominoes that have yet to fall, and this is a really big first one between SK Gaming and Shifters, where Shifters are going to be able to pick up a victory. They're going to get themselves to 5-6 in terms of their record, and while that does not mean that they are safe, it certainly does put some pressure on some of the other teams throughout the rest of this week. It means that with some certain results going their way towards the end of this week, they could be a team that actually salvages the horrible position that they were in going into week number 4, because this really looked like a team that was dead in the water after really underperforming last week, after being so bad in week number 2. Even with the good start that they had in week number 1, it felt like they just were not going to be a team that even could come close to making the playoffs. But with 2 wins across this week against 2 bad teams, understandably, but with those 2 wins, they've at least put themselves in a spot where they could theoretically make playoffs if a couple of games end up going their way. For SK, they were already eliminated heading into this. They were not going to be a playoff team. This only reinforces the fact that this team is done, that they are not going to be competitive. They were worse than like most teams in the league. Like, again, the only team that I think they were consistently better than was K-Corp Blue, and even then, like, K-Corp Blue at least won on the final day. Like, that is something you can put in their cap that you can't say for SK Gaming. This team is in complete disarray right now. They have multiple players who are playing like some of the worst in the entire league. Their outlook doesn't look very good. The way that they're playing their macro is by far the worst in the LEC. There's just not a lot of good to talk about for SK heading in to split number 2, but let's talk about them after we talk about Shifters, of course, on the winning side, because I think there are some interesting things to mention for Shifters, considering that this also could be the last time that we see them throughout split number 1 here. Paddock, for me, is going to get player of the game on the Yunara. This is much more of what we were looking to see out of Shifters in terms of their playstyle. I like Nuke a lot, but Nuke is really at his best when he gets to be a secondary carry for his team. I've talked about this plenty in previous years on this channel. Nuke's biggest problem is that he's really not this game breaker. He is a very talented player in the mid lane, and he's very consistent throughout all phases. He's a good early, mid, and late game player. He doesn't really have a massive weakness. He's good at shoving and roaming. He can play late game team fighters if he needs to. He's a solid player. He's kind of that jack of all trades, but he really isn't like a hyper carry. That is the one thing that he doesn't really do at a high-end level. If he is the best player on your team, you are going to have some problems, or at the very least, if he is the best carry on your team, you are going to have some problems. And so you needed an AD carry, to play with Nuke that could really carry a lot of games, that could get resources and be that #1 option, so that Nuke, when he generates resources individually and isolated in the mid lane, could be that secondary option without a ton of jungle assistance. That's always been where BDS or Shifters have been at their best in terms of playing around him in the mid lane, and Paddock finally started to come through on a hyper carry in this one. Yopo was fine on the other side of this on the Xayah. His support completely gave up on him, as he always does, but Paddock certainly had a much bigger impact, I think is the fair way to put it, at the end of this game. And that's really what ended up making the difference. So credit to him. Trimby continues to be fine. He made a couple of bad plays in this game on the Alistar. Those 4 deaths might not look like a lot, but they were not very good to watch. And so you could get a little bit concerned about that. But still, a lot of the engages did end up working out. And I think he did set up the Yunara relatively well to be able to capitalize, even if he was making mistakes, that like at least they were able to pull gold back from it. And obviously it ended up working out in the end. Trimby gets way more hate than he deserves in terms of the way that he is playing. There are a ton of problems on Shifters. I don't think Trimby is even in the top 3 in terms of problems on Shifters. And so, again, I just don't really, I think the hate is really forced on this guy right now. It seems like people just don't view him very highly. Bukata and Rooster were good in this game, and I think that that is a good sign. These players have not been super consistent over the course of this split. If Bukata is better than one jungler in the league, it might be Skeens at the current moment. Ironic enough, considering that, of course, SK ends up selling off Bukata to go and bring Skeens in. I'm not saying that that was a worthwhile deal for Shifters, because they paid a lot of money to go and get Bukata from SK, and I'm sure SK will take the money over either of these 2 players. But at the end of the day, Bukata definitely performed better in a matchup that he needed to. Skeens was miserable in this game, which we will talk about, and Rooster also was really solid on the counter pick on the top side with the Rek'Sai. Generally, this just felt like a pretty stable and solid game from Shifters. Do you want to see them be more dominant? Maybe, but this isn't a particularly good early game team, and they really don't have great hands right now either in terms of the way that they're playing. They kind of need slower paced games to kind of go their way and to bleed out enemies just through like little cuts, if you will. And I think they have the resources to do that. They have the players to execute on that, but especially if their AD carry and Paddock can really kind of overcome what has been a bad start to the year for him and really start to live up to some of the aggressive expectations. That is the key, I think, to unlocking Shifter's success, and whether or not that's going to happen here in split number 1, if they make the playoffs, or, later on in the year, that's kind of what you're hoping for. And then for SK on the other side, I mean, they're just bad. They're the worst team in the LEC. Like, that is abundantly clear. Of course, K-Corp, LR, they're going to go back down to tier 2 or disappear entirely if you're LR. SK immediately becomes the worst team in the entire league with the way that they are playing right now. I'm serious, man. I'm so tired of this odd even year Mickey X thing actually being true. Like, I say it every year as a little bit of a meme, like a little bit of a joke, and kind of going like, oh, Mickey's been really bad in even years. Don't forget that he always pops off in odd years and then plays really bad in even years. It's real. Like, this is genuinely becoming something you have to be concerned about. Mickey X is dud of the game again. He was awful across both of the games they played this week. He was even worse here against Shifters than he was earlier on. It's so frustrating to watch a player player that has been the top of the support ladder in the LEC for a long time just play like such a robot to like not even a good robot, like a dysfunctional robot that has absolutely no understanding of what's going on around him. Like it just, his programming is broken. I don't really know what's going on. He's either mega tilted or he's just so committed to making bad decisions that his team is going to suffer for it. I don't really know what to tell you. He is getting outclassed by every support in the game right now. And it's not just like, oh, he's playing for leader. He's playing for Skeens. He's playing for Wunder. He's ignoring Yoppa. The engages he's making are bad. It's every part of the game that is faltering right now for Mickey X. It's not one bad decision. It's just not good. Like, it's really, really looking bad for him. He's got to completely change the way he's playing the game if this team even wants to try to be competitive. Another big barrier or hurdle, I guess, to this team being okay is that Skeens is terrible in the jungle. He might very well be the worst player in the LEC right now. I'm not going to say that for certain. I think that there are some good candidates for that role, but he is certainly within the running. He was awful in split number 1. And again, I hate to say it, but this is more the Skeens we expected when I watched him play in the TCL last year and he got that promotion to SK. Any goodwill that he earned towards the end of last year felt, I guess circumstantial at best because he was the only okay player on SK Gaming. And now that there are other good teams and that he has to actually try and step up and be a piece on a team that's trying to win games, it's clear that he is just not good enough for that role. He is the worst jungler in the league. And again, kind of vying for the worst player in the league right now. Wunder, leader, they weren't even really the problem here. Wunder wasn't nearly as good this week as he had been previously, but he had some not good matchups, and that's not entirely his fault. It's certainly a drafting problem for the team to not play around their only good player. Leader was also fine, certainly wasn't the issue in this game, even if he also wasn't the solution. Yoppa continues to show a lot of really nice things mechanically, but I think he's getting bailed out a bit more by the fact that the rest of the team is awful. Like, nobody on this team is actually good right now. Maybe Wunder, but again, like, he had some bad matchups this week. It's really just a bad look for an SK team that, once again, an org that is like at the bottom of the standings. They find themselves here every single year, and it feels like it's just rotten at the core. And for Shifters, obviously, this is a massive victory. You're very happy to pick it up, but you still need things to go right towards the end of this week. You still could win both of your games this week and not make the playoffs. That's the kind of hole you dug for yourself with some of the losses earlier on this split. You obviously hope that doesn't happen for a team in Shifters that I think is starting to put things together, but if this is the last time we see them this split, at least they ended it on a high note. Then moving on to our 4th game of day number 2, and this was probably the matchup I was most excited for on this final day. It was Na'Vi taking on Movistar Koi. And Movistar Koi are finally going to pick up the pieces again and get themselves a really dominant victory. Sub 30 minutes, which is actually kind of rare here in the LEC. Very insane. Like, the length of games is so much longer in the LEC than it is in any other region. I think part of that has to do with the lack of, like, consistent late games right now in the LEC for most of these teams, especially, the combo of good early game and good late game. But I think even more so just it's the way that teams draft in the LEC. You're not seeing a lot of these Movistar Koi drafts like the Vi, Talia, and the Corki Nami. Just like, let's win an early game, let's snowball things out of control. You're not really seeing a lot of drafts like this, but we see that when a good team plays a good draft, yeah, the game's really easy. It's really, really simple to be able to pick up a win. It did feel like they locked back in for this one, and it felt like a lot of the mistakes that they had been making that were completely unnecessary in a lot of different games, they just weren't there. Na'Vi had a couple of problems. This is a team that I've really praised for their drafts and for their meta evaluation over the course of the beginning of this split. I guess everybody gets one. I mean, let's be honest, the moment that we came out of draft, like, we knew this game was over. Like, there is not a single way for Na'Vi to be able to play this at any point. What, you're expecting the Pantheon to completely hold over the early game with Caitlyn so that Vi, Talia, Corki on these one-item power spikes don't just, like, instantly destroy your entire game plan? How is Azir ever supposed to play this game? How is Pantheon ever supposed to play this game? This is an impossible to win draft for Na'Vi. Like, this was just never going to be something that they could play at any point. I'm not putting it entirely on the draft, but I certainly think it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest factor as to why this game ended up being so easy for Movistar Koi. So, that's kind of out of the way, but we'll talk about what actually happened in the game here as well. Player of the game for me might surprise some people. I'm actually going to give it to Supa on the Corki. This feels like a weird one to give out, mostly because I don't think Supa was the one that was creating a lot, but like, this guy's positioning and his aggressive plays in this game, that was, I mean, exceptional. Like, really, you're watching this guy play the AD carry position in this game and you're going like, oh my goodness, like, this is what you get excited about in terms of like the future of European AD carries. And I know Supa is no longer the future. He is the present. I'm much higher on Supa than it feels like every other analyst is. I get comments every single year that criticize the fact that I put Supa as a top 3 AD carry over Hansama. Well, he's better than him. And he continues to show that in his best games, he can still perform like the top guy in the region. Like, there are going to be moments where he looks like that. He was phenomenal in this game on the Corki, and I don't think he's getting enough praise for just how good he was both in and out of lane into a Caitlyn matchup that is not always the easiest for Corki and Nami to be able to play out. So Credit to Supa, very, very good stuff from him. Want to give a lot of credit to Elyoya, obviously, as well. Most of the games this split, Elyoya has been the best jungler in the entire league. I think Relich, ironically enough, from like a pure production standpoint, has been up there with him, but it's clear when both of these guys have to go toe-to-toe in like a decently neutral environment, Elyoya is a better player, and he's going to be able to create more and do better with the resources he has across the map. This guy's awesome. I mean, he would have been in the running for MVP if Movistar Koi didn't have like a random, bad stretch of games over the past couple of weeks. He still might be the favorite for MVP for a lot of people. He really has been that good. He's the best jungler in the league, and he continues to prove it. Jojo was much more stable here. Alvaro was obviously very good. Mirwin goes deathless on the Scion on the top side. Just a lot of really good stuff happening for Movistar Koi in this one. This was kind of a destruction. Again, I think a lot of that started in draft because this is unplayable for Na'Vi, but Movistar Koi ended up capitalizing on it better, not really making mistakes and punching their ticket into the playoffs with this victory. For Na'Vi, you wanted to end your split on a high note. You could have ended here as like a top 2 seed and really somebody that was looking kind of unbeatable going into the playoffs, a potential title favorite if you really won this game, but was not meant to be, didn't have the firepower to be able to really close out on the note you wanted. This isn't the worst loss in the world. Even when I was talking about Na'Vi, really breaking through and being an upper tier team, I was talking about them being top 3 because, again, I just hold on to hope with this Movistar Koi team because their problems are just so fixable that, they're going to be able to figure it out and get there by the end of the split, and that looks like it's happening. Na'Vi is still a very good team, though, and I think with a better draft, things might have gone different in this game. They just never really had a chance. Relich, for me, is dud of the game. Impossible to play as the Pantheon here. Still got completely out-jungled by Elyoya. That is definitely not something that I'm going to pass off on him, but like, dude, how are you ever supposed to play Pantheon in this game? Like, Caitlyn Nico is drafted specifically to dominate the 2v2 and to get a lot of plates on the bot side. Pantheon can never punish this Corki Nami lane at any point because they're either going to be pushed in because the Caitlyn is winning lane, or they're going to be losing and this Caitlyn's going to be omega useless. There is no way that you can ever play bot side here, and then you play around Aatrox and Azir on the other side into Sion Talia. It's impossible for Pantheon to play this game, and I hate this. I hate this idea, man. I'm so tired of this, and I get that it's mostly an LEC problem, but if I see one more team drafting Pantheon Azir or Pantheon insert late game scaler here, I'm gonna lose my mind. Like, I genuinely just do not understand what all of these coaches aren't seeing, and I know that I'm not like the foremost guy on like what is the strongest in the meta, right? There are going to be people out there that have a more, well thought out opinion than me, but I certainly, have good thoughts on the draft. I've been able to showcase that on this channel on LPL English for quite a long time, and this is not good. This is bad draft philosophy, and it just continues to bite so many of these teams in the butt when they really have no reason to be piloting it. So am I frustrated? Absolutely. Hopefully this kind of weeds its way out naturally because it's not winning anywhere right now in the world and just it kind of fades into the background. That is the hope. Obviously, Poby needed to play better, but like, dude, you're one scaling Azir on a team that's losing early and has no late game scaling insurance policy. Like, you are the late game scaling policy, and there's no way for you to play laning phase because you're going into Talia Vi, your bot lane's losing, your jungle's losing, your top lane's losing. How are you ever supposed to play this game at any point if you're Poby? He's 0-4-0, obviously. It's not going to be good. He misplayed a couple of major circumstances, but this game is hard. Like, Samdi and Paris never had the chance to play. Mainter never really has the chance to play. Na'Vi just were in such a bad position going into this, and it really ended up biting them. Hopefully they're better in the playoffs, but it's a big win for Movistar Koi. It guarantees them playoffs and obviously puts them in a position where they can still be very relevant going into playoffs. I'm not going to say that they're favorites. K-Corp has very much overtaken that spot despite their week 1 loss to Movistar Koi, but they are definitely about as close as it gets, and I think the best version of MKoi very well could still be the best team in the league. Then moving on to our penultimate game of the week here and of the regular season, and boy, what an upset we got, really, to close out both of these teams' regular seasons. It was Team Heretics taking on K-Corp, and Team Heretics is going to pick up the victory here somehow, some way. This is the hottest team in the LEC heading into playoffs. It's them and Vitality of all teams right now that are just white hot and at the top of the standings, pushing their way into the playoffs. Just absurd. K-Corp ends up falling on the final day here. Obviously, this doesn't really matter for them. I'm sure they weren't particularly committed. They played Jace LeBlanc, which I think is playable here. I want to make this clear. This is a playable draft from K-Corp. I know some people are going to meme on it, but I say it's better than what Na'Vi had in the previous game, even though they drafted less, like, quote-unquote meta champions, if you want to put it in that direction. But Team Heretics just executed better. Even if they didn't have the best laning phases, they were so much more clinical from the mid-game onwards that this game blew up almost immediately. Really great stuff from a Heretics team that I think is looking super fun right now, and they're not even playing the stuff that I think they would be even more dangerous on. Again, like, I'm looking at Ice and Stint, and I'm going like, okay, you guys were really good in this game, and I still want want to give a lot of credit to these two, especially Stend, who I think is playing really well right now. But imagine if you were playing hyper carries and got the lead that you got, because Ice is really good on these hyper carries in the early game. It feels like they're nerfing themselves and they're still winning games. It's kind of ridiculous. So credit to them, and credit to Saren, who's going to get my player of the game here on the Aurora. Not the best laning phase in the entire world for him on the Aurora. That LeBlanc matchup can be very tricky. That's why Yehu ended up opting into it. Yehu, obviously a very prolific assassin player, has been somebody who's played that a lot on the DRX system over the past couple of years, not just the LeBlanc, but a lot of things in this more aggressive style matchup. But Saren ended up really making Yehu's life miserable as we got out of the laning phase. It didn't really matter that this guy was down in resources and that he wasn't doing particularly well in the 1v1. Kaliste and Busio were his targets as the game continued to go along, and this Aurora was just absolutely diabolical in terms of the damage that was being output. Saren looked lost at the beginning of this split. He looked like I don't want to say a downgrade, because Camelou really was that bad for Heretics last year, but he looked like a side grade from the worst mid laner in the league, which is not really something that you want to see. That has all washed away. The past like 5 games, he has been excellent for this team. It feels like he's really found his footing, and I'm excited to see that was more of like a, just kind of getting used to the league kind of thing, and not, oh, Saren's actually a bad mid laner. I think we wanted to see this guy perform well because he's been to international tournaments before and he's been on high-profile teams, and obviously it's really good to see him start to lock in and really be a big piece for this team over the past couple of games. Already talked about it a bit, but the bot lane was massively in favor of Team Heretics in this one. Kaliste and Busio Omega gap earlier on in the week, and they look phenomenal, and they look like they can't be stopped when Busio gets barred. And then Busio gets another one of his best picks in the Nico, and just kind of runs it down. This game is completely invisible, and then obviously makes some terrible ultimates at the end of this game. Don't really know what ended up happening there, but Ice and Stand obviously ended up benefiting pretty heavily from it. The Jhin just continues to be the thing that this team goes for. I don't really understand what their fascination with Jhin is. It's a good pick, but they're playing it literally every single game, again, when it kind of goes against the philosophy that I think this team would be best at. Who am I to say, though? They're on a winning streak right now. They played Jhin twice this week, and it ended up working out for them. So credit to the bot lane. Sheo continues to look very good. Definitely outplayed Yike in this one. Yike did not look good on the Jace. That was 2 Jace jungle games that we saw this week, kind of the Omega pick of the patch, and neither of them looked particularly good. I guess the LEC is just not very good at Jace. We kind of already knew that, but I guess it expands to the junglers and not just the top laners. Sheo was definitely better on the Rumble in the jungle here, which was shocking to me. I saw this draft and I went, well, it's clearly Mbessa in the jungle, not just because that's more meta, but because it's Aurora in the mid lane, and you want to probably use that Mbessa to play off the Aurora a bit more consistently than the Rumble. Nope, Sheo felt more comfortable on the Rumble, and it worked out. Trayson wasn't dominant on the top side or anything on this Mbessa, but jungle mid worked. Bot lane was excellent this game. Team Heretics are just on fire right now, and they're looking really good doing it. And then for K-Corp on the other side, I'm not going to say I'm going to completely throw out this game, because that feels bad to say. K-Corp has had multiple games this split where they've not necessarily shown up and been super consistent, but this isn't who K-Corp is. This is not the team that we're expecting to go into the playoffs as the #1 seed. Busio was awful in this game. He's dud of the game very clearly. This happened last week too, and I think people just forget about this again when people are like, oh, how can you not give Busio player of the week? It's because he'll have a game like this every once in a while. He didn't really do this last year in North America, but he certainly is kind of adopting the European style as he's become a European national player, a regional player, I should say, without the import tag here for K-Corp. And it's just, you got to live with it. If your support's going to be a bit flippy, sometimes he's going to have no impact on the game and really disappear and then lose you the team fight at the end of the game. It's just going to be what happens. Kaliste was arguably just as bad on the Varus. I love Varus. I think this is the strongest ADC in the game right now, but if there is one region I don't trust to play Varus, it's absolutely the LEC, where their AD carries are constantly stepping up and getting caught out by assassins. No thank you. I think Varus is super consistent in a lot of scenarios, but only if you're not actively killing yourself, and I don't know if any LEC AD carry is actively going to do anything other than kill themselves in team fights. Yehu was good in lane, but didn't do anything on the LeBlanc outside of that. This is a pick and a champion in general that kind of has to snowball, or else she's completely useless in the late game. Kind of same thing for Jace, but Jace is just naturally a bit more useful. Yike was not the problem this game, and then Kana, obviously, on the top side was also not the issue, but for K-Corp, it's not too bad of a loss. They're still going to be going into the playoffs as the #1 seed, and you're not going to worry about that too much. But for Heretics, this is massive. This could get them a top 4 seed. They're above 500 going into the playoffs at 6-5. The fact that they're even here is kind of ridiculous considering how they started and generally what the expectations were for this team. We saw a lot of good out of them at the end of last week when it felt like they found their style. They moved away from their style and still found similar levels of success. This could genuinely be a bit of a scary team heading into playoffs. But that's going to bring us to our final game of the regular season, and who better to end it than the 2 most historic organizations in Europe, the biggest rivalry in Europe. It's Fnatic taking on G2. And G2 is going to pick up the victory. Sub 30 minutes, sub 28 minutes on this one. Really, really big win for G2. They absolutely needed this towards the end of this regular season run. They were looking bad. I'm going to be entirely frank with you. There were multiple games where I'm like, oh, this team is cooked. Like, they're not even close to top 3. And you know what? That might still be the case, because as much as I'd love to sit here and go, oh yeah, they dominated this game. They, pick Xinjiao Orianna, which I think is good in terms of mid-jungle pressure. Labrov opened up the map a bit with the Bard that I thought was really nice. Hansama had a really good game on the Sivir. Like, there were a lot of really encouraging traits that I really wanted to see out of G2 that they had not shown in other games. Fnatic really might be that bad. Like, that might be the closer reality of the situation, is that Fnatic might just be terrible at League of Legends, and if that's going to be the case for them, that's a bit of a problem. Like, that is definitely a bit of a concern for Fnatic fans out there, because honestly, I am not walking out of the regular season feeling good about Fnatic. This is a playoff team, but like, this might be a top 7-ish playoff team rather than a top, 4 kind of playoff team, which is definitely not what you wanted to say about this team. But we'll get into it a little bit later. We'll start with G2. Player of the game for me is going to Caps. I mean, this Orianna was massive. Whether you want to say it was Caps doing all of it, or just the fact that Orianna as a champion was super valuable in this one, I think it's kind of up to you. There's a reason this champion very rarely gets through draft phase in basically every single region, and that's because she just affects the game so consistently. She's really good in every phase right now, super consistent at making sure your jungler is in a good spot to be able to skirmish, and especially for something like Xinjiao, like, obviously he can kind of fall off a little bit towards the late game if he doesn't have a lot of gold. That's basically entirely, I guess, taken away by getting to play with Orianna and getting all of those free extra stats on the shields going in. You can be a lot more aggro with the way that you engage, and the shockwave is obviously something you can follow up on incredibly easily as something like Xinjiao. So credit to Caps. He was great on the pick. He found some big shockwaves. He hit that 4-man shockwave with everybody sitting in the bush against Bard Orianna at the end of the game. Obviously, that turned out that way. How was it ever going to go any other direction? But Caps still ended up hitting it, so you do want to give him the credit. I do want to give a lot of props as well to Labrov on this Bard. I think he's not going to get nearly as much, hurrah out of the rest of this team, in comparison to Hans and Skewmond and Caps, obviously, because they were very good here. But Labrov, to me, was the second best player for G2 in this game in terms of making plays happen. His Bard looked a lot better than it did last year, and obviously, it looked a lot better than whatever game he played on day number 1, which was not very good. This was a much better showing, I think, from the bot lane in general. Luspa's been a good support player, I would say, at this level. Not a superstar, but a decently good support rookie at this level, and Labrov definitely got to outplay him on the Bard in this one. Hans was obviously very good, goes 10-1-9 on the Sivir. His game was super easy, but at the very least, he was able to capitalize when his team set him up, and not every AD carry is going to be able to do that. Just need to see this happen a bit more consistently with Hans, who has not been very good in or out of lane. Skewmond was much better, definitely gapped Razork in terms of the way they played here. Broken Blade was really strong. I mean, G2 kind of did all the things they needed to do, but this was not one of those games where I'm like, oh, G2 really had to fight and really outplay Fnatic. Fnatic rolled over and died in this game, and I think that is the most frustrating part for Fnatic to end out the regular season on, is that there is no, like, fire under this team right now. It really does not feel like any of these players are particularly locked in with the way that they're playing, and that's scary heading into the playoffs, right? Like, this is not a team that can really afford, from a mechanical perspective, to not be, like, locked in 100% of the time. They are good, but they're not that good. Impyros is one of the weaker top laners in terms of his raw laning and mechanics, and, Laspa is a good rookie, but he's a rookie at the end of the day. You need players like Razork and Vladi to be consistent out of the mid-jungle, the most important part of the game right now, and they're the weak links of the team. Like, they are the problem. Vladi, for me, is done of the game. This could easily go to Razork in the jungle as well. They are not playing well. I don't really know what to tell you. Both of them have been atrocious over the past couple of games, and you just have to hope that it's eventually going to figure itself out. Even at the worst of Razork and Humanoid, when they weren't playing off of each other, when Humanoid was dying level 3 every single game because the gank was so repeatable and they never once tried to defend it, even then, they would still have moments in the mid game where it's like, okay, I can see the talent coming through. These two are not clicking, and they're not playing well individually, together, all of it. It's all going wrong for this Fnatic mid-jungle duo right now. They have to be able to fix this as soon as possible, because these are not two players that should be performing below mediocre at this level. Both of them should be competing to be all-pro caliber players, and neither of them are even average right now at this level. They need to get better. Both of them were awful in the regular season. Again, Vladi gets it for me because the Azir was even more useless in terms of the damage. At least Razork was, like, not running it down every single fight, but Razork also wasn't proactive. He wasn't making plays. He wasn't doing anything on Vi, one of the strongest playmakers in the entire game right now. Just super frustrating. Of course, Lospa got outplayed by Labrov. That's not exactly a good sign, but the entire map was falling apart. I'm not exactly blaming the Nautilus for this game. And Bessa and Jhin were not the issues. Ironically enough, like Upset is still doing his thing. I'm not always going to... it's going to be rare for me to blame Upset on this team because it's just... he doesn't have that same kind of control that the rest of them have. And Imperos, ironically enough, also wasn't the problem, even if he is probably the weakest mechanical player on Fnatic. This team has real issues. It's very similar to what we talked about with G2, but theirs are much worse. Like Razork and Vladi are playing off of each other in bad ways, and if we're complaining about, oh, G2 has a bad bot lane and a bad top side, it is so much more problematic to have a bad mid-jungle duo right now in this meta. Like, that is not the part of your map that can be your weak link, and unfortunately for Fnatic, it really does feel like it is their weak link right now, and they have a bad top side with Imperos that is not going to be super consistent against a lot of the other top laners in the league. I like Upset and Lospa, and I think they've been good this split, but they can't do everything on their own on the bottom side. Fnatic genuinely might be a like back end of the playoffs kind of team, like a team that doesn't win a series and goes out in like 7th or 8th place. Like, that's where Fnatic might be, and if that's the reality of the situation, that is a nightmare for this organization with what they thought they were going into with this year. And then for G2 on the other side, it's a nice win. It doesn't completely, get rid of all of my worries and my doubts about what G2 can be in terms of beating top-tier teams, because Fnatic is clearly not a top-tier team, but at least ending out the regular season with a win is nice. If Hans and Labrov and Broken Blade on the top side, if they can start locking in a bit more, that's all that needs to happen for G2 to get more competitive again. It's why I still think they are a clear top 4 team in the league, but if they want to be top 2, if they want to be top 1, potentially getting themselves back to being champions, they need to be able to continue this level of success for a lot more than just one random game. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC versus week number 4 overview and analysis video, and that is going to do it for the regular season here in the LEC. We are moving on to our first playoff bracket, of course, of the year in split number 1, but before we do that, let's wrap up the regular season by going over my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 4. Player of the week for me in this 4th and final week was Linsauce, the jungler for Vitality. I'm not sure this is going to be a particularly popular opinion. I don't think any of my choices for player of the week or honorable mentions are going to be particularly popular, but I do think Linsauce was the best player on the Rift across 2 games this week. He played Pantheon both times, yes, but both of those Pantheon games were incredibly influential, and I think if he played slightly worse in either of them, things could have gone very differently. He Omega gapped Movistar Koi, not the only player on the team to do so. Basically, everybody on Vitality played well, but Linsauce was a big part of that, and then he, to me, was the biggest reason why they were able to take down LR and secure their spot in the upper echelon. We'll talk about what that means for their playoff hopes as we continue to move on and talk about the bracket, but Linsauce was excellent this week, and he deserves player of the week from my perspective. This was a relatively easy choice. Then moving on to my honorable mentions, first one's going to be Sheo, the jungler for Team Heretics. This one I think is going to be less controversial than maybe the other one on this list, but Sheo was very good. Heretics are peaking at the right time, and it feels like he is a very kind of undersold piece of why they're doing so well. Sheo has just kind of been jungle gapping a lot of people towards the back end of this split. They really made a push to keep this guy in the offseason, and it's very much working out for them. And then Trimby, for me, is going to be the other honorable mention. A lot of people online hate this guy and think he's not playing particularly well. I will go as far as to say that I think people in the league community generally don't understand what the support position does and do not know how to evaluate players of that role. I think Trimby has been really good for Shifters. I think that there have been bad games, certainly, especially when Shifters isn't playing particularly consistent, but Trimby has not really been the problem on that team, and in fact, in their 2-0 week this week that tried to get them into the playoffs, ultimately failed because of some other results. He did everything he could. He was the best player on a team that went 2-0 this week. That is worthy of an honorable mention alongside Sheo. And then dud of the week for me, this one is pretty easy. Unfortunately, it's going to Mickey X, the support for SK Gaming. The only reason this might have been a little bit difficult is I really wanted to put both Razork and Vladi as dud of the week as well for week number 4 because of just how bad they played in both games. But unfortunately, because they both kind of share the blame, it's a little bit easier to just kind of point fingers at Mickey X, who was just awful on SK Gaming and is also a big reason why that team is not making playoffs. Probably the biggest reason in terms of just overall, like what is wrong with SK Gaming right now. So Mickey X for me is my dud of the week, and Linsauce is going to get my player of the week for the final regular season week, but that transitions us nicely into the LEC versus playoffs. Top 8 have made playoffs. They have been sorted onto 2 sides of the bracket, and now we play double elimination until we have a champion. Very excited to see how this goes. As per usual, the way the LEC format ends up working is top 4 teams end up getting split across the top and bottom sides of the bracket. In this case, it was K-Corp, Vitality, Na'Vi, and Team Heretics that are kind of split across the bracket, and then the other teams are just kind of slotted and then picked based on who gets each side. So GX and G2 are on the top side. K-Corp got to choose who they would rather face between GX and G2. They chose GIANTX, which is to be expected. Therefore, that top side goes that way. Same thing for Na'Vi picking Fnatic over Movistar Koi. So that's how that ended up working out. That's how we got our first round matchups. Remember, this is double elimination, so losing in the first round is not the end of your run, but it's certainly not good to burn your extra life so early on. It makes your road a lot more difficult, as you can see from the amount of games you would have to play on the lower side of the bracket. Who do I think will be moving on out of round number 1? Well, starting at the top here with K-Corp taking on GIANTX, it's pretty easy to predict K-Corp being able to pick up the victory here. Not only did they just beat GIANTX in week number 4, but they're the best team in the league until proven otherwise. I think this team's not going to have a ton of trouble with this matchup. Maybe they drop a game, but I'm not even really predicting that they will do that. I think this will be a pretty clean win from K-Corp. Then you have Team Heretics taking on G2. I think this is also a decently interesting matchup because Team Heretics might be the hottest team in the league alongside Team Vitality right now going into the playoffs, and G2 are obviously decently cold, but they're G2. Like, do we think they're going to be able to live up to their own standards? I think they will. I think G2 should be able to handle this series pretty easily. As much as I like Heretics, I think they've kind of benefited from the downturn of a lot of other teams rather than like really reinventing themselves in that same kind of way, and G2 always shows up for playoffs regardless of how they perform in the regular season. I don't think they're top 1, but I think they're good enough to get past Heretics and get into that upper bracket round 2. As for Na'Vi versus Fnatic, this is a nightmare draw for Fnatic. I actually think they're major underdogs here, and I think Na'Vi is going to take this series. They've been better across this split, and there's really not a lot of reasons to believe that Fnatic as a brand or as an organization is going to be able to overcome the way they've played in the regular season. They are a below 500 team in terms of performance, and you know, it's not like G2 where it's like, oh, these players should be able to figure it out because they've had success before. I have major question marks about whether Fnatic is even going to win a series in the playoffs, let alone a matchup against a Na'Vi team that I think is genuinely good. So I have Na'Vi going over here, and then probably the most interesting matchup of round 1, Vitality taking on Movistar Koi. Again, Vitality has been excellent over the past couple of weeks, as we talked about with Linsauce, and obviously Humanoid and Knock and Fleshy have been excellent. Karzi was excellent this week. Everybody feels like they're clicking, and Movistar Koi were the victims of that in week number 4. They couldn't quite take down Vitality. I think that there is a real shot for Vitality to kind of pull off the upset here, but I'm not going to predict that. I think Movistar Koi are going to lock in a little bit more, be a little bit more attentive, we'll say, going into the playoffs, and I think they should be able to pick up this series. So my predictions in round 1 are K-Corp, G2, Na'Vi, and Movistar Koi. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those predictions down in the comments section below. Very curious to know where you end up landing on those matchups, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every single playoff series as per usual on this channel, and then First Stand is right around the corner, which these teams are trying to qualify for. We'll be covering all of that tournament as well. We cover 3 of the other major regions, LCS, LCK, and LPL every single week, and their playoffs are starting now as well. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all